Welcome to Belonging Reimagined. I'm your host, Dr. Mona. As a mental health therapist, professor, and researcher, I guide folks in owning their belonging journey and exploring barriers to belonging. In this podcast, I explore real stories with phenomenal guests about how to experience both interconnection and interdependence. And my hope for you is that you learn ways to experience more connection in the world around you and the world within yourself. We don't have to do this life thing alone. You're right where you belong. We are thrilled to have Dr. Shelby Kittinger today on the show to talk about a topic that is a little bit heated, that's come up quite a bit. We've seen different shows about this on Netflix and other networks, and it could be a little bit of a touchy subject. I invite you all to hang in there with us as we explore this. We're not picking on anyone in particular. Dr. Shelby will get into that, but we are going to be talking specifically about belonging while experiencing religious trauma. So let's get right into it, Dr. Shelby. Can you tell us a little bit more? You're a clinical psychologist. Tell us a little bit more about your journey to becoming a clinical psychologist and supporting others in their healing journeys.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be part of this. My journey towards becoming a psychologist was maybe a little happening as it went. I didn't really know what psychology was. In light of our topic, I grew up in a very small, kind of very interconnected religious group. And so exposure to mental health was definitely not something I had, let alone psychologists. And so as I graduated college and was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, I was really thankful to have mentors come into my life who I think saw something in me before I did and kind of provided language for the things I wanted to do. And even as I was applying to grad school, kind of figuring out what it was and what the job was. And along the way, so thankful that I got it. I feel like I have a dream job in a lot of ways. And finding my way into religious trauma, I think, similar to so many aspects of our field, I think a lot of the things we are naturally curious about, we probably have our own personal connection as to why we're naturally curious about it. It's really a topic that, because it can be heated and because it can feel so vulnerable, often comes across very taboo. And I think I'm a person who is really drawn to taboo. I like to really break down barriers and not feel like there are things that we can't talk about, especially in therapy. So it's been a real culmination for my own personal journey and then professionally, but I love it. I feel like I found myself in a great spot, and I'm really excited to talk about it today.
I'm so glad that you're here. I think you saw me presenting at a conference recently, and then you reached out and my team connected with you, and they were just so excited that you had reached out. And so I'm thrilled to be talking about this subject. We live in the South. I live in the South. And there is, it's a quite religious community. Mm-hmm. On top of it, I'm also Egyptian. And so I come from a fairly kind of religious culture in many ways. A lot of that is starting to break down just worldwide. We're seeing statistics around that. But for me, this was a topic that was really interesting to me, just from what I've witnessed up close, and how, religion can be super supportive and helpful in people's lives, how it can be a guide for many people, but also as a clinician and just personally what I've witnessed because of the cultures that I live in and come from, I've also seen how that's not always the case for everyone. Yeah. And so, religious trauma is one of your specialties. And for our listeners who might not be familiar with what this concept is, can you help explain to us what religious trauma is, how pervasive it is?
Yeah. And, kind of maybe to offer this precursor, I invite people to kind of let the guards drop. We're not trying to dog on religion. It's like you said, there's actually a ton of research that shows that religion can be a protective factor for trauma. It can be a very supportive piece of identity. But in the same way that we talk about, being in families, the hope is that you have secure attachments and caregivers who love and support you. We know that doesn't always happen. And we approach the consequences without saying, oh, it should be this.
Mhm.
And so I often think about that with religion, that there are a lot of people who find identity and community and belonging in religion. And that doesn't mean that there aren't people who feel very hurt, very dismissed, and experience trauma within it too. And so I think I try to approach a lot of these, taboo topics or things that can feel hard with not comparing it to what it's not. So by talking about the pain, we're not dismissing the acceptance, and vice versa. So that's my spiel about, maybe we can all approach it honoring it for what it is and not what it's not. To maybe kind of build off of that, religious trauma is still in the works, really within research, but also kind of in definition. In the 90s, Marlene Winnell coined religious trauma syndrome. And that was this idea of people who experienced really intense suffering in attempting to leave authoritarian or dogmatic religions, and talked a lot about the damage of indoctrination and how that impacts cognitive development, typical childhood development, so on. In the last 10 years, really since the 2016 election, that was a big kickoff for talking about religious trauma. I would say the branch is really wide in that it captures physical, emotional, relational suffering. And usually it's more associated with what we would consider chronic PTSD or complex PTSD. It has a very similar presentation because when you've experienced trauma in religion, it usually is repetitive, chronic, multiple sources over time. So the understanding of trauma and how it fades into religion, I would say religion is like the umbrella under which trauma can occur. It's probably the best way to think about it.
It doesn't necessarily mean that if you are religious or if you identify with a particular religion, that you're having a traumatic experience with that.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And even with that, trauma is also an umbrella under which religious experiences can be a part of, right? There's kind of this back and forth between that. So as a clinical psychologist, then, what are some of the ways that you see this manifesting in your clients, the impacts of religious trauma? So somebody comes into your office, they're sitting down talking with you. What kinds of things are you seeing in the ways that they're presenting?
It's exactly what you just named. Like trauma, it's so wide. It's such a wide word that we use even in the field. Sometimes we're using it so broadly. When it comes to religious trauma and how it impacts people, I would say it's the same. It's so broad. A lot of the pieces, though, that I see start to come into the work actually really blend into your model. This idea of where it impacts you on a personal, your selfhood, how it shows up in your relationships, your community, and then this kind of universal understanding of where do I go from here? A lot of existential dread. But I would say some of the biggest pieces that I tend to work with are, a lack of agency or really just a lack of trust in self. Some of the time when you've experienced religious trauma, what I hear often is, I don't know if I'm a reliable narrator of my experience, because such a huge part of being traumatized in these spaces is that because so many people are involved and so many people are kind of naming the same thing, it's like you're pointing at the sky and saying it's blue and everyone is saying it's green, and you're having to fight with this war within yourself and within your community. So the idea of trusting yourself can also feel sinful or shameful. The self or the flesh is seen as evil. So having to deal with what's good about me, how can I trust myself if I'm sinful or if I'm inherently bad? then that can spread into body image, the relationships you hold, um, how you even just developed. I see a lot of, maybe this is a crass way of putting it, but immaturity, not having typical childhood development of trying out your own ideas. And so then as you're moving through the world, very intense black and white thinking, not being able to hold space for gray. So I would say those are some big things that show up. But again, it can spread to so many different places, sexual identity, politics, religion, it all gets so interwoven because religion is the foundation for a lot of folks. And so when you start to disrupt the foundation, everything, it's like everything in the kitchen sink goes with it.
I love the point that you're making here about loss of trust in self. That's what I've also seen clinically is this I've been told that the sky is this color. Yeah. And I've had a lot of different people saying the sky is this color. And why is it that I'm looking at the sky and seeing a different color? Is there something wrong with me? And so I see that like happening already within that community, that the person is already feeling some kind of shame, like what you're talking about. Is there something wrong with me? And so, when we're talking about like real life stuff, it could be, I see it a lot with partners, like, oh, this is a great partner for you. They're wonderful for you. And you're just like, I feel something's a little off here. And it's like, but he's nice and, has a good job and calls me when they said they're going to. Kind of the basics, right? But there's not, the person might not necessarily feel something there, but they feel like they should. It's very like black and white, like what you said. And it's interesting that you brought in like politics and some of these other things, because I say that a lot of the divide that we feel in this country and in this world at large, but particularly in the United States, is that it's like developmentally, we are adolescents. Like we are at this very dualistic kind of thinking developmental stage of like, this is good, this is bad, this is right, this is wrong. And there's not room for many things to be true at the same time. Yeah. So all of that feels very interwoven, like with the immaturity. And I'm not saying the adolescents are immature. They're where they're supposed to be developmentally. We're talking specifically about where you would expect for someone at a developmental stage. Because I've worked with people in their 60s who are working through some deconstruction of religion. Sometimes they're holding on to their religion, but leaving a particular community. Yeah. And that is the first thing that I notice about them. So I love that you mentioned that, because you're helping me put some of this together too, is this, I don't trust myself with dating. I don't trust myself with what I should choose for dinner tonight. Yes. I don't trust myself with what color I should paint my walls. We're not literally talking about the sky, folks. We're talking about like day to day and how debilitating it can become for folks to break down that system of thinking that somebody else is the
authority.
Thank you. Someone else is the authority on what's right and wrong. Yeah. And that I don't have any voice in that whatsoever.
Exactly what you're naming. It can feel hard to find that language, because if you don't feel like a reliable narrator of your own experience, how do you even put these things to words? And so even in therapy, I think a lot of when I'm starting to work with someone, and even just being able to identify with religious trauma, I think is a huge win internally, to, have that advocacy for yourself, like, hey, something didn't land right in this experience. And then it goes into the really intense struggle of, what do I want to do with this then? Do I want to keep it? Do I want to wrestle with it? Or do I want to leave it? And I think that's where, what you're naming, exactly what you said, even down to the point of, I don't know what to order for dinner, can be so paralyzing, because I don't know if I'm making the right decision. And when every decision you've made in your life had eternal weight on it, of course,
I
Mhm.
literally get goosebumps when you say that. Every decision you make has eternal weight on it when you're
Yeah.
in these particular communities.
Yeah.
That's heavy.
It is. And so of course, how could you hold that alone? I think that's where so much of the work, even outside of processing trauma, and this is true, as a clinician too, sometimes when you're doing trauma work, you're rarely talking about the trauma. You're talking about how to bolster around it because all of the supports, all of the buoys have been, just abolished. And so compassion, having some patience for yourself, allowing yourself to try things on, play with ideas that you might not want to keep. I see that a lot when, I might take a risk and throw something out that feels a little harsh to a patient, well, it sounds like you really hated that. And it can feel really jarring, it's such intense language. And this idea of inviting someone into play and not have to keep an idea. I think that's a huge win, so trying to bring in compassion, trying to bring in nothing is permanent. We're allowed to change our minds. Those are invitations to kind of practicing agency that before were so housed in fear and shame, it was debilitating to even try.
Yeah. And when you talk about trying things on, I actually, being autistic, I'm actually literally picturing people trying things on and trying on different clothes. I've noticed it with color. We were talking about paint color earlier on the walls, but also with clothing color. Like, oh, I only wear this certain set
Yeah.
of colors, right? I don't
Mhm.
go outside of this range. And I've worked with clients before on literally just saying, why don't we try this color? What do you think about trying this? Like getting a scarf or, getting an accessory, something that's starting out kind of smaller, a t-shirt, where it's not like some big investment, something like that. And it's interesting to see how people can start to change their self-concept
Mhm.
when they start to change the way that they are physically even showing up with expression and even in their own home. So a lot of times I'll start with their home, and it doesn't have to be something as drastic as painting your room a different color, although oftentimes it leads to that eventually. It could be artwork, right?
Mhm.
Or furniture, like a piece of furniture that I'm like, do you actually really like that? And so like challenging yourself to think about what do you actually like and what do you not like in ways that are really, really safe,
Yeah.
that aren't going to have, this eternal weight to it, as you said earlier. And
Yeah.
it's interesting to see how people can sometimes like really break down into tears just from trying on a different color t-shirt, and be like, whoa, because it can open up this whole well for
Yeah.
folks. I don't know if you've seen that before too.
I'm like feeling it as you're talking because that is exactly what shows up in so many of my sessions. And I actually think, what you're saying is really profound to people who have experienced religious trauma because asking someone, well, what do you like? What do you want? What do you need? Those are not familiar because the idea is that you die to yourself for religion and you are integrated, you are part of the flowing river with everyone else. There is no separation. And so, even those really small acts of not just thinking about it, but then actually trying it on. Okay, I am going to paint this room. Oh, I hate it. Then you have to grapple with, I made the wrong decision. I should have stayed. I shouldn't have done anything. And so, this like really tumultuous process of not just thinking about it, acting on it, and then not liking it and having to change your mind is so threatening if you have been told, there is no you, there is only us. Right. And so,
Yeah.
any of those questions, like, what do you want? What do you need? What do you want? Is life changing.
And the point of there is no you, there's only us, it essentially says you as an individual are kicked out of this equation.
Mm-hmm.
everything about you is kicked out of the equation except for how you show up in a way that has to be like us. And that is not belonging. That
Right.
is straight up assimilation.
Yeah.
And that is saying that you as yourself, you can't trust yourself because you are inherently bad in some way, or you are inherently not like us. And so you need to be like us in order to be safe. And we are creatures that are inherently motivated by survival. And so if we feel like it's not safe to be who we are, then we will self-abandon. We're not going to see ourselves. Anything that we see, we're going to be scared of if it's different from the other. We're certainly not going to embrace anything that we see. And we're not allowed to celebrate because that feels like it's unsafe, unless it's going to be aligned with the movement, we'll say, with the movement.
I love the way you broke it down. It maps on so perfectly to the process of religious trauma because that is exactly how you walk through it. But I love the word that you use of being celebrated because I think that hits on one of the biggest grief points when you're deciding if you're going to leave religion or you're just processing religious trauma is the realization that you will not be celebrated by your community if you leave. And oftentimes that's not just like friends, that is someone's entire family, back to their great grandparents, or it is their entire community, everyone they were raised with, who they've known since they were an infant, the whole world they've known, that if you take this risk of trying to be more of yourself, you will lose everyone else and you won't be celebrated for the decisions you make. That is the biggest grief point. And I love that you use that word in your model because I think it's such a bold undertaking to even think about when you feel like if you're belonging or not, do you feel celebrated? I think that is like a really profound question to ask yourself.
Yeah, because celebration is an action. And it can also, when we think of celebration, we think of it as a party, right? Like someone's like, oh, good job, you're patting you on the back. Celebration is an action that's rooted in being respectful, and it's an acknowledgement of someone. That's an open acknowledgement. And so celebration can start over. Celebration can look like, I see that you don't like that, and I support you. I see that you don't like the color of the walls. I hear that you're not liking the color of the walls and that you want to paint it a different color. Good for you.
Yeah.
You don't like that? I love the color, but you don't? I got you.
Yes.
Let's work something out. That is what a celebration can look like. When you're in a community that says, this is the way and this is the only way, and anything that differs is not that, then if you're that different thing, then you can't be celebrated. So even then it's like, are we truly being celebrated? Is it actually you that's being celebrated, in those communities? Maybe sometimes it's not, it's not that. Again, we're not going to make that a black and white kind of question, and I think that's what can be confusing about it, is that when we don't even know who we actually are because we haven't been given the safety, not space, but the safety to explore that interiorly and exteriorly, then we don't even know what's real and what's not real in terms of what we were being celebrated for. Because we don't even know, was I actually showing up as myself or not? So we didn't get the opportunity to figure that out. And that grief is huge. Yeah. It's huge. And we don't like to be uncomfortable. As people, we don't like to be uncomfortable, especially in Western society.
Yeah.
We don't like discomfort. We avoid it at so many costs. And so a lot of times people will stay in the community because they instinctively know that they're going to be experiencing that pain and that loss.
Yeah.
Then what's the upside of it though,
This is why I love this conversation, why I love this work, because I think just being able to be one of the people asking these questions or even making these points and not needing an answer.
Yeah.
That is such an invitation that, again, people wanting to do this work don't get just this invitation to sit with a question that can feel unanswerable and say, that's okay, we don't have to answer it. Because so much of religion is you need to commit your life to this. You need to know, you need to trust, and you need to essentially give every moment of your life to when you fail or when you don't meet the mark, recommitting. And to kind of sit with, I don't know if I'll ever know, and to feel like we don't have to answer that is really scary, really daunting. But exactly what you said can only be sat with in safety. And that's hopefully the space we're providing in therapy, hopefully building a new sense of community. But yeah, terrifying.
Terrifying, because people can be losing all the different types of belonging on the belonging integration life map. I mean, they could be using that universal belonging of like, this is your life direction, and this is that existential kind of life purpose that you have. They could be losing their communities, like we just talked about, interpersonal relationships that they might have within the community, but also maybe in overlapping communities, like within the family.
Mm-hmm.
And that brings me to thinking about queer identifying folks, which is a population with whom you also specialize in working with. It's LGBTQIA plus individuals. And when we're thinking about queer folks, we are seeing a disproportionate amount of religious trauma.
Yeah.
And I'd love to really dive into this, because with religious trauma, we see increased suicidality. We see increase in substance use and abuse. We see people who are insecure with having a place to live. We have more anxiety and depression with religious trauma. And so when we're seeing a disproportionate amount of religious trauma in the queer community, then we're seeing a disproportionate amount of all these other presenting concerns that we're talking about here. So what are some of the unique ways, Dr. Shelby, that you see queer identifying folks experiencing religious trauma?
That's exactly what you said. It's this unique bracket. So not just leaving community and dealing with the grief of loss, it's also this outright rejection, because fundamentally most authoritarian religions do not even recognize a queer identity. When you kind of look at your model, the selfhood on the most basic level, who I am as a person is abhorrent to this community that says they love me. That's one of the biggest mind fucks you can have. So, yeah, I mean, it's kind of like what we were just naming. I don't know if there is this exact path, but when I'm sitting with folks, one of the things I see, depending on where they're at, so I kind of break up experiencing religious trauma again, and they're in it, they're still in it, they're still in the community, they're just starting to have these questions. They're deconstructing, so they've started to have conversations, they're starting to recognize the impact, and they're warring with themselves and what they want to do. Or they've left and they're dealing with the grief. And kind of in all of those spaces, I see a lot of anger. And I think that's probably the biggest thing that, again, in a lot of religion, you're not allowed to be angry. Anger is not an acceptable emotion. And so this like really severe repressed anger, being able to actually voice that is a huge part of the work, I think, with being queer and leaving religion or just grappling with religion, is anger. And then, like you said, it threatens your actual survival. You're being told that who you are fundamentally at your core is sinful, unacceptable, has to change. So it's really like, how do I build an identity knowing that everyone who says they love me is rejecting me? I mean, it's so cruel almost, the exposure to that. No, it is cruel. So, yeah, I might be trailing off a bit, but I think it's kind of this fluid experience, everyone having a really different one, but the impact I think is so severe because not just leaving religion is what you're going to be rejected for. It's you as an entity. Your being is unacceptable. And if you choose to leave, you're not just rejected for leaving the community, the safe haven. You are seen as lost and giving into evil. I mean, like the language around just being yourself is so risky to step into that when they are on the other side, or if they do choose to leave, I think anger and then not wanting anything to do with religion, it's kind of this then like reverse rejection because they have to do that to kind of keep barriers, keep boundaries. It's like, I want nothing to do with that ever again. I don't want to do anything to do with anyone who's part of it. So I think there's a lot of grappling. It depends on where they're at in the process. But yeah, kind of the overarching themes, I think anger, having to really pull themselves up from the core, say my identity is worthwhile. Yeah. And then a lot of the just rejection. I never want to see that ever again. I don't have time for that. It's And of course, right? I mean, how could you not?
Yeah, because it's trauma. It could be activating to be around anything that's associated with any religion, even if it's a group that's completely different or a community that's totally different from where they came. And, it is really a mind fuck, like you said, because coming out, the process alone is considered celebratory. Yeah. And it's generally considered this very exciting time in many ways. And there's also so much grief that happens for folks in general of this path that they thought they were on or that they were trying to be on, and that they're not going to be able to necessarily like assimilate into certain groups as they thought they would, or they're going to move through the world feeling a little bit offbeat sometimes. That is the assumption, at least. And so there's some grief that's involved really for most queer identifying folks. I don't want to say everybody, but for many, okay? That's already there. And so when you add to it, leaving a community that told you in so many words that you're abhorrent, even if they didn't say it to you directly, they're talking about it, right? Yeah. Then that adds that extra layer to it, which can be traumatic. So how do people in general, when they're coming out of religious trauma, or let me start over. How do people who are leaving communities, specifically religious communities that have created this very specific type of trauma, religious trauma, how does the healing journey really begin for them in terms of like, we have the self-concept, right? That part that we were talking about early, but let me start that over, Julius. For folks who have left communities that have been oppressive for them, that have told them that they're abhorrent in some way, that have said that it's my way or the highway, and they're leaving, and now they're feeling isolated. And they're trying to figure out, how do I rebuild my world? What are steps some people could start to do to create that human connection that really is central to our survival?
I think the question of the moment right now, again, because religious trauma is such a new term that we're even using, that people are identifying with. It's not a new experience, but it's definitely a new term. Finding community and other people who really get that, that can feel really daunting. I advertise that I specialize in religious trauma, hopefully to be that, even if, a lot of people when they're first leaving probably wouldn't say it was traumatic, but they'll see that I work with people who, have been in religion. And so it's like an invitation. I always talk about Reclamation Collective. It is a nationwide organization that offers support groups, offers workshops, has a directory of therapists all over the nation who do work with religious trauma or spiritual abuse. So those are, exciting new developments, people actually specializing in this, writing about this, offering this, hopefully offers community. I work in Portland, Oregon. That's where I live. And so, when we're talking about the queer experience too, I think there is one of the things that the queer community does so beautifully is belonging, is this reinvitation into belonging. So I would encourage people, one of the things that when you're in these really inundated religious spaces, what happens is that they say, if you have to connect about this. Earlier, you were talking about dating, and it's actually really funny because a lot of the time it's, well, they are in the same group I'm in, or they believe the same thing I do. And then all the other things that make you who you are, your hobbies, your passions, your interests, aren't as important for compatibility as the belief system is. What I would encourage when wanting to reach back out into community or find a sense of belonging is to think about, what are the other parts about you? There are so many ways to connect with other people if you remove religion having to be the only thing that connects you, the only thing that binds you.
Yeah.
And I think the queer community does that really beautifully, and we can always take note from them. What they have trailblazed and bulldozed through to get is that you can connect over a lot of other things. That would be my invitation for folks, even just dabbling in this idea is, well, what are the other parts about you? When you have connected, what are the other things that shine through? And that might take a little bit of sifting and digging, but being able to connect over, again, passions, hobbies, other values that you have, understanding your values and connecting there. I think that reminds you that there are a lot of other people. These can make it feel like that's it and everyone thinks that way. And that's just not true. There are so many other people who want to accept you. There are so many other people waiting to love you and to belong with you. And, there's hopefully an invitation for hope on that side. There are so many other interesting things about you that you can connect with people about.
Yeah. And that, like, identifying what your values and what your interests are, that is really learning how to see yourself more fully in a richer way. And just the process of doing that before you even connect with other people, that is giving you a deeper and richer connection with yourself. And so that increases your self-belonging, right? It's like,
Yes.
I'm starting to know more about who I am because I'm creating more safety. And if we can create that safety within ourselves to say, you know what, I don't know what's going to come up. That's that uncertainty piece that you were talking about earlier that can be really difficult. I don't know what's going to come up, but I'm going to love my way through it. I'm going to love the things that come up in me, or I'm going to explore these things like, hiking or, different hobbies. It could just be something that you are enjoying yourself. Like, I have a client who the way that she really kind of breaks up the noise is by painting. Like, she goes and she paints, and that reconnects her with herself. And that gives her a sense of belonging that feels like, okay, I can go out into the world now, and then we can go the other way around, like just exploring the world at large, being in nature, feeling like you belong to nature. And that can help kind of tether us, is a word that I use quite a bit with belonging. Like, being out in nature, go be a tree hugger or just go sit in the grass, whatever you want to do that gets you out to see, what this beautiful earth is made of. It can bring us back to ourselves, but back to one another and back to, paths that we would have never experienced before, and can really broaden our perspective. Because I think that's what I'm really hearing from you, Dr. Shelby, is about broadening your life experiences and what it is that you even think about, beyond this thing that could be an important thing for many people, but doesn't have to be the everything.
I think that's right. Being tethered, having some other connection points. I like a little part of myself that I will share sometimes with patients is in my own therapy years ago, my therapist, I think, took a really big risk and asked me, what if there wasn't a God? What if there wasn't this? Because my morality, my values, everything about me was so wrapped in, and I couldn't see outside of it. And even just this invitation to ask myself, what if this isn't it? Even if you want to keep it, exactly what we named earlier, it's not really about you have to leave. It's about reconnecting with yourself. What are your values? What do you want? What do you need? And having choice. And I still think about that. I still work with that therapist. We hopefully are all going back into our own therapy all the time. But I will never forget like how impactful that was for me to have someone just ask me essentially, why do you think this? And not recite, the thing I've been told, but to ask me without any shame or any expectation, why do you? And I think there's also, kind of on the reverse side, if it feels scary to ask, well, what else is there about me? Because those things might not have developed, to then maybe ask, this thing that you are, this thing that feels like the whole thing about you, to start asking, well, why do you think? Why do you want? Why do you need this part? Or what stands out to you about this? Why does this feel valuable to you? And again, not with the intention of getting rid of it, but just to be curious about it.
Yeah. I love that question, because it's not a suggestion that, for someone who is aligned with the source energy or the God energy, it's not a suggestion like, oh, there's not a God. It's like, but what I'm hearing too, Dr. Shelby, is what would you be doing and what kind of decisions would you be making if there wasn't a God?
Yeah.
And that really could increase our self-trust, because does that mean you're going to go out and like do terrible things in the world? Probably not. Like you probably have your own moral compass that's just connected to your own moral compass, And that's a great question, because that really can help us learn to build more trust in ourselves and be like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
I'm a loving person. I don't even want to go into good and bad, right? I'm a loving person. I'm a kind person. And that could even lead us to what our values are, right? Figuring out who we really are. If it wasn't for this one thing that we think, we're scared to explore because of that one thing. Yeah, I love that. I love that. So for folks though who are saying, hey, I really want to hold on to my religion. I want to be connected to my religion, but I don't want to be connected to this religious community, or I want to be connected to my religion, but I'm overcoming and trying to heal through religious trauma. What are some things that they can practice, or some perspectives that they can take on? What are some things that would be helpful for folks who are in that position?
Yeah, I think it's so tied into everything we've been naming around, if we could release the black and white and be curious, does that question have to be asked at all? Do you even have to think about leaving, staying? Because a lot of the times, because these things they have this eternal weight, things feel so impactful. If we say, well, if I stop believing in this, do I have to cut off my parents? Do I have to leave? Do I have to stop going to church? Do I have to stop doing all these things? And what I'll tell patients often is, are those things coupled, or can they be separated? Does deciding what your values are, what you think, what you believe, if they change along the way, do they have to change any of your choices? That's one of the really powerful things about choice, is that we get to be hypocritical. We get to do it incongruently. You do not have to say, well, because I don't believe this, I'm never going to church. I'm never thinking this. I'm never going to see those people again. Because that's the black and white, that's the extreme, and that's where it starts to get really scary. So to say, my encouragement, or some of the work that I do with folks, over time, is really grappling with, do you have to ask that question at all? What would be the cost? What would be the benefit? The cost might be when you're at family events and they start praying, you pray, even though you don't usually pray. or maybe the cost is sitting through a service with family. Maybe the cost feels greater. Maybe the cost feels like there are conversations happening every day that threaten your well-being. And again, to separate it from choice just for a bit and to say, are you okay with that cost? Can you pay that cost? Does that consequence feel too heavy? And so I think before making any choices, to kind of invite curiosity around, what are the costs? What does it offer you? Which one are you willing to follow? And then you get to make a choice, and you get to make a choice that could be really incongruent from your values. And that is also okay,
It could be incongruent with some values, but congruent with others. It could be like, I'm going to bow my head because I'm going to keep some peace here. And that doesn't align with praying for me in this way, at this particular time. Right. Mm-hmm. So maybe I'm going to bow my head and I'm going to say my own thing to myself, my own kind of mantra to myself. Maybe I'll just take it as a moment of meditation. It could be like a both and. Be like, I'm keeping the peace. And this is not something that I would normally do.
Yeah.
And also I can kind of make this my own in my own way that doesn't have to feel like it's disruptive. Or it can be, that's too big of a cost, is what I'm hearing from you.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm not able to do that. Mm-hmm. So I will sit there and I will keep my head up and I will be respectful still while they pray, or I will excuse myself and, walk away as they do that. And maybe there's some, like you said, some conversations that are had. Maybe there's some conversations that are had with that particular group of folks.
Yeah.
Beforehand, if it's like a regular group of folks, like family, for example. I mean, it's nuanced, right? And it's customizable. I think is what I'm hearing too from you. Like you get to customize it. This has been a wonderful conversation. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what religious trauma is, about how it shows up. And I think the thing that we want to keep in mind when we're working with folks, either professionally or personally, or you have colleagues or, someone close in your life who is, really going through the healing journey of religious trauma, is the last thing that we need to do is add more judgment to the way that they're processing that, because that's exactly what they're trying to get away from. And so my hope from this podcast is that our listeners either see themselves reflected in this, if that is something that you all are going through, or that you have a little bit more understanding if you have a loved one or someone in your life who might be going through this experience, and understand a little bit more about what keeps people tethered to certain communities, and also, what they might be going through as they're coming out of that and transitioning from that. Mm-hmm. And with that, I'd love to hear from you, Dr. Shelby. What does belonging mean to you?
I think belonging is the space to be curious, to change your mind, and to know that no matter which path you take, there's an embrace on the other side. So by yourself or by someone else, that feels like belonging to me.
I love this because it sounds to me like belonging is really the safety to explore who you are, having the safety to do that. Mm-hmm. So beautifully said. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your very bright spirit, I must say. Thank you so much for doing this with us today. We appreciate you. We appreciate the work that you're doing in this world and to your communities. And I know that you're making a tremendous impact. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Shelby.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's episode. All of the show notes and links can be found on my website at drmonanour.com. That's drmonanour.com. Throughout most episodes, you'll hear me referring to the belonging model that I developed, which is represented by a belonging life map that helps you explore areas in your life where you feel more connection and areas where you might feel more isolation. And you can get a free copy of your own belonging life map on my website. Again, that's drmonanour.com. If you like the Belonging Reimagined podcast, please subscribe and consider leaving us a review. That can help more folks find us and keep more episodes coming. Until next time, I'm Dr. Mona. You're right where you belong.